it's too late to save the planet. We will have more inflation, more natural disasters, more conflicts, more inequality. So in this book, I discussed 4 futures. And then one that is closest that we are now entering is climate fascism.
Welcome, Saitō Kōhei, and it's a wonderful pleasure to have you here in this interview for Lucy on the Worlds. Thank you so much for being with us. And it's particularly a pleasure because we have here one of the most prominent Marxist scholars in the world right now.
That's an exaggeration.
That's an exaggeration, but I mean, in 2000...
Marxism is dying, or maybe that's a deep crisis.
And you are an exponent of the crisis, but I think not, because in 2018 you were one of the youngest recipients of the Deutsche Prize, which is one of the most prestigious prizes for Marxist studies right now. And your books on Marx's connection with the ecological crisis have resonated very deeply, not just in Japan, but also in the rest of the world. And the Capital in the Anthropocene had so much resonance, if I think I'm right, that it also increased the sales of The Capital by Karl Marx in Japan. Is that so? So it's quite interesting. But I would like to start. I'm really curious about your political education, because I think that people approach the work of Marx right now. You say it is in crisis somehow, but it also have a new actuality in some way. I think in the popular imagination, Marx is sort of seen as a relic of the past, but I think one of the great merits of your books is that you really try to reactivate his heritage in a way that's very relevant to our current situation. So I wonder, how did you become a Marxist? Were you always leftist in your youth? Was it something that was passed in your high school environment maybe, or in your family, or was it just an intellectual endeavor?
Yeah, so compared to, the famous European Marxists, it's not like I'm not coming from those, family tradition with Marxism, not at all. And I wasn't really political when I was young, so I came rather late to the socialist idea. I think the beginning was around 2001. It was like 9/11, and then after that, the Iraq War, when I was like a high school student, 16. And then that time, people like Noam Chomsky talked about, of course, against the war, but then that's how I started reading some of his works and then become more interested in socialism and so on. But I never read Marx when I was in high school. It's only after I entered the University of Tokyo, so it's like when I was 18. And I thought it was like really good. I mean, I had some issues with war and the inequality in Japanese society at high school, but I didn't really know how to like explain these situations. And then when I connected these problems with capitalism, like from critical perspective, it made more sense to me. That's how I started reading many books on Marx and the contemporary capitalism from Marxist perspective. But I have to admit, at that time, I wasn't really paying attention to ecological issues. But the financial crisis 2008 convinced me that what Marx is saying has some importance even in today's society. So that's why I decided to go to Germany to study more seriously, like Marxism and Marx. And then after that, there's a 2011, like a very big earthquake in Japan, and then Fukushima nuclear disaster, right? So that really made me more conscious about how capitalism not only exploits workers and creates economic crisis, but also this gigantic technology for the sake of massive consumption and production also creates ecological disruption in our relationship to nature. And so that's how I became more ecological. But for me, it was always important to connect these reading of Marx with issues like inequality or Iraq war, and then later Fukushima nuclear disaster, and then now more like climate change. So for me, it was always Marx's analysis that helped me to understand the ongoing crisis of capitalism.
It's quite interesting when you do this chronology, because I think it's the chronology of a lot of millennial trauma, and I think one of the reasons your books resonated so much is because we also recognize a sort of both intellectual and emotional and political response to this kind of crisis. But I digress. When you came to Germany, you, in the years, started working on a very ambitious project, which is the MEGA, the Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe, which is a fantastic work. It's the new edition of the complete works of Marx and Engels. So a thing that I find really fascinating in your work is that it's not a pure philosophical speculation in the Marxist tradition. It's a strong context, a very strong contact with the texts, with the manuscripts, and you found some very surprising things in these manuscripts, I think, that really challenge our ideas, our preconceived ideas, like on Karl Marx. And one of the things that I found most shocking was Marx's interest in science, in the natural science. So what did you find there?
Yeah, so after the financial crisis, 2008, I decided to go to Germany. I thought there will be, because I went to actually the US to study my bachelor undergrad education, and then I was disappointed that there are not many people talking about Marxism. So I decided to go to Germany, expecting that in the country of Karl Marx there will be more discussion on Marx, and then I was disappointed again to find out that at the university, especially after the reunification in 1991, they basically kicked out all the Marxists, right? So it was really kind of desert. Not many people talking about Marx at university anymore. But luckily I was in Berlin, and then people are actually talking about Marx. There are like reading groups and activists outside the university. But also for me, what interesting and important was, as you mentioned, this encounter with this project of complete works of Marx and Engels, which actually takes place outside the university, which is edited in this Academy of Sciences. Since I went to this Academy of Sciences, I found out that Marx was really reading so many books on natural sciences, and he was interested in issues like exhaustion of the soil, deforestation, and even extinction of species. So that was like really eye-opening for me, because at that time I was really interested in how capitalist development actually creates ecological disasters. And then Marx was witnessing, of course, not a nuclear disaster, but at the time, of course, the exhaustion of the soil was a huge social issue. And then scientists were talking about how we can actually create new technology to prevent what's the reason for this kind of exhaustion. And so like a lot of lively debate going on. And then Marx was also paying attention to these issues. And then that actually creates conditions for rereading Marx, because we used to believe that Marx was quite optimistic about capitalist development, because capitalism, of course, exploits workers, but also creates a lot of innovations and new technology. So once workers take control of those means of production, they can just utilize all those wonderful technology.
And everything will go smoothly.
Exactly. And then overcome all the environmental issues and so on. It's called productivism.
Yes.
But Marx was actually not that naive. That's something that I realized. He was kind of naive when young. But as he became older, and then that's how he started reading more natural sciences seriously, and that's how he witnessed, precisely because of the capitalist technologies, the development of productive forces, there are so many problems, because these technologies are invented in order to exploit from workers and also from nature more efficiently. So that creates tension, right? If these technology are inherently exploitative or destructive, how could we use these technologies in the future society? And then that really resonated with this problem of nuclear power plants. Could we use nuclear power plants in socialist society? And I came to the conclusion basically it's not possible because these technologies are still dangerous, but also it's very anti-democratic. Undemocratic technology, it requires a lot of concentration of technology, information, and money and so on. I think my interpretation created some, there are, of course, people in the 70s and 80s who already discussed something similar. But yes, my approach was basically going back to Marx's own writings, that he is really trying to integrate comprehensive critique of capitalism with much more critical ecological perspective. So I think that's really useful even to understand today's ecological crisis like climate change.
So I think in your book it's very interesting the way in which you deal with Marx's interest in science, because you show on one hand a kind of optimism, but also on one hand a kind of pessimism. So on one side we have science as a tool for capital's dominion of nature, for extraction, for workers' exploitation. But on the other hand, we also have science as a mean to contrast alienation, to retake control somehow. So I'm just curious about your take on this.
Yeah. So if you read his notebooks, you can more clearly see how his idea shifted. So when he was young, he was more optimistic. And then as time goes on, he became more critical of capitalist technologies. But that doesn't mean that Marx became like so pessimistic, or he didn't become kind of like go back to nature, abandon all the technology. Of course not. He still recognizes, and we all do recognize, that the technologies are often indispensable, necessary conditions for overcoming poverty, hunger, and better communication, and creates a lot of conditions for democracy and freedom and so on. So I think we really need to distinguish, and I learned a lot from French philosopher André Gortz. He distinguishes two kinds of technology. One is open technology, so that creates more conditions for democratic management of, our communication or our relationship to nature. And the other one is closing technology or locking technology that creates more domination and so on. And then I think the contrast is very clear. One is atomic nuclear power plant is the manifestation of this locking technology. And that creates, of course, the concentration of technology, but creates inequality between big cities and the countryside, like Tokyo and Fukushima. But also global north and south. All the uran is coming from the global south. The labor of extraction is dangerous, and then it is imported to Japan. But then after the usage, now Japan is talking about exporting these nuclear waste to Mongol or somewhere else to, keep it underground. So that's really a lot of exploitation, lot of extraction, lot of inequality. And then if you compare that with more open technology, example is solar power. Of course, that also requires a lot of extraction, but at least it really allows more democratic, horizontal management of electricity production, that everyone can be even the owner or the producer of those energies. But of course, the problem is extraction. So that's why I think that here comes the not like super optimistic idea. Okay, we have renewable energy, so we can just like produce many things and then overcome all the ecological crisis and so on. No, that's not the case, because technology is always accompanied by those extraction and the resource and energy usages. So we cannot infinitely try to grow. And then that's how Marx became much more critical about just taking the power of capital by workers, and then we can just maximize. So this idea of maximization It's something that Marx clearly abandoned in his late life. And then I think that's very important because we, even today's society, we tend to think that with Green New Deal or with some kind of, green technologies, we can just continue the current way of life without really changing anything. And I think that sounds quite easy and attractive, but the problem of the transformation to the sustainable society, just and sustainable society, requires much more radical rethinking of our way of life and also the mode of production. And I think it really creates the interesting sphere of thinking and discussions.
And I think one of the great merits of your book is that you succeed to seize the sustainability term back from the liberals somehow. And you do so with a very interesting concept, which is, I think, a concept that travels all the way across your work, which is the concept of metabolism, of stuff like cell. So what is metabolism and what is the metabolic rift, and how does it explain capitalism's incompatibility with life on this planet on the long run?
So as Marx read many books on natural sciences, some people, of course, played more important role for him. And then one of the central figures is Justus von Liebig, the German chemist. And then his central concept is this metabolism, Stoffwechsel. And basically Marx took this concept from him to understand the nature society relationship. And his idea is very simple. Basically, that we have to work upon nature and then extract resources and energies and many things out of nature and then produce in order to satisfy our desire. So this is a process of production and consumption and extraction. Then after the production and consumption, there will be waste, there will be carbon dioxide, and there will be many other things that you just have to go back to nature, or we have to reuse or recycle and so on. So this process, this is a kind of circular process, is what Marx and Liebig called metabolism. I mean, that sounds today quite intuitive, but what Marx made it interesting is he was really deeply interested in how this basically, in all society we have always this metabolic interaction, but how this metabolic relationship is reorganized and transformed from the perspective of capital in our society. Because capitalism has a very unique way of organizing this metabolic interaction. Why? Because our society is producing things not for the sake of satisfying our needs, but for the sake of maximizing profit or economic growth, or Marx's expression is capital accumulation. It's all about growth, basically.
It's not about use value.
Exactly. So that's what Marx distinguished: use value and value, and then it's about value. And that means many things. This is a more ecologically complicated process of interaction, the metabolism. But capital, just pay attention to this very abstract notion of profit to organize this metabolic process. And what's going to happen? Basically, Marx says, market expands, economy expands and even accelerates. But the natural metabolism, the nature, how things are produced by nature, wood, animals, and fossil fuel, they don't really change, right? So there is a very strong tension between social metabolism of money, commodity, and capital on the one hand, and then the metabolism of nature on the other hand. And he says there will be a very deep rift. Basically the chasm emerges, and then that's what Marx called the metabolic rift. And that was the time that Marx was discussing this, like a deforestation, exhaustion of soil, as I said. But today we are witnessing the disruption of carbon cycle, for example. That's a manifestation. But we are also witnessing nitrogen cycle, because we spend so much of artificial, the chemical fertilizer in the agriculture. So these are like the ruptures or the rift that our society, capitalist society, creates. And then his conclusion is basically that capitalism tried to fix this rift by inventing new technologies and so on, but he thinks it's not possible to fully repair. It only shifts it to somewhere else, like shift it to global south or shift it to local people, like poor people and so on. So that's actually really what's happening today too, right? Like rich people basically are much more responsible for climate change, but they have means and money to escape from negative impacts of climate change. And the people in Bangladesh or Pakistan suffer more. So that's basically shifting the lift to someone and somewhere else. But my point is basically, so Marx recognized that in order to really fix this rift, we have to basically abandon the society that is driven by the logic of profit maximization. So that's how he comes to this more eco-socialist idea of the future society by studying natural sciences. And I think this is really important, even today's climate crisis.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the global south, and you mentioned like this translation crisis, like the waste is produced in some place and then it's moved somehow in other places. But for Marx, the global south also becomes a resource. And this is another surprising thing about your book, because I think one of the main reasons of the distrust that the contemporary left has for Marx is that he is still seen as a kind of Eurocentric thinker. But you show that this was not the case.
Exactly. So Marx was actually studying two things in his late years, and one is, as I discussed, natural sciences. But the other one is surprisingly actually non-Western pre-capitalist societies like Russia, of course, but also Latin America, India, Indonesia, and so on. And what's really interesting is that, yes, as you said, we often think that Marx is Eurocentric thinker. Why? Because he is often associated with this optimistic productivist. When we have higher capacity of production, higher productive forces, it's closer to socialism. That means that Western societies are, of course, closer to socialism. And that means that he even says in the 1850s that the Indian societies don't have history because those communes are always there for many hundreds and thousands of years without changing. So the British colonialism must come in first and then destroy. And then maybe Indian society can also, develop like British society and then have a socialist revolution. That sounds really almost and even justification of a capitalist empire, right? But in his late years, he really recognizes this problem. Why? Because it's really deeply related to ecology, because he recognizes now that these capitalist technologies are actually destructive. It's destroy nature. Is this higher, like superior technology compared to non-Western societies? Like non-Western societies are much more sustainable for hundreds of thousands of years, as I said. And then capitalism is coming into Russia or North America, killing all those indigenous people. And that's what Marx was also like deeply interested, right? So that means like Marx actually started to question that these capitalist technologies are actually not good. And that means that the Western societies are not necessarily higher or superior to non-Western societies. And then he even says, it's like 1 or 2 years before he actually dies, he even says that the Western society have to learn, like he expressed it, return to actually non-Western societies in order to overcome the crisis of capitalism in Western societies. So he now thinks that it's not Western capitalism showing the model of future development. He now thinks that the Western society must actually learn from the non-Western society in order to imagine a much more sustainable and equal society. So this is like a radical transformation that are little known before, but thanks to this mega Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe, we now have access to those process of his studying new materials, new ideas, and then we can probably change his idea about productivism, Eurocentrism, and then he becomes someone much more concerned about the issue of ecology, equality, of course, but also decolonial struggle and so on. So these are things that actually we today often still have to care. And that's why I think the Marx's understanding or critique of capitalism and his idea of future society, which I call degrowth communism, is very important even today.
Exactly, and like you mentioned the main concept of your book, which is Degrowth communism, your proposal, which has kind of a shock value because
Yes.
we would never associate in our like traditional understanding of communism as something that keeps the economy stable, the GDP stable. And you also show philological evidence for this, which is Karl Marx's letter to Vera Yasulich,
Yes.
which was a Russian revolutionary. So what is the growth communism and how does it show in that letter?
So in the first book, the Karl Marx's Ecosocialism, I didn't discuss degrowth. I simply said that Marx was deeply interested in sustainability. He was an ecologist thinker after establishing this theory of metabolism, metabolic rift. And then that was 2016, 17. And then 2018 and 19, there was a global ecological movement against climate change. People like Greta Thunberg started to organize strikes, and that had actually a deep influence on me because I recognized that still I was hoping that after some kind of socialist maybe revolution, we will have much more efficient installing solar panels and electric vehicles, and our society will grow even more, but in a sustainable way in socialism. But yeah, people like Greta Thunberg, she was basically saying that it's a fairy tale to believe some kind of eternal growth. And I was like, that's actually true. I was so naively imposing today's model of development to future society. But if you really look at data about energy and resource consumption, it's clear that we are simply over-consuming and overproducing. And it's not simply possible to overcome this problem by making technology more efficient. Because even if technology becomes efficient, we often produce even more or even consume more. So that really cancels it out. So that's how I started to be more interested in degrowth ideas. And then their idea of decolonial, eco-feminist critique of capitalism and so on. And then, so that's like the point. I was like, I have to imagine the formation of alliance between socialists on the one hand and degrowthers on the other hand, because they often fight each other. Like socialists say, "Oh, degrowth people are unpopular. They are just all talking about austerity, anti-technology." And degrowth people say, "Oh, Marxists are productivists and they don't care about ecology and so on." That's how I thought that, maybe I might be able to help this debate. And then, as you said, I started looking at his late notebooks and also the letters to Vera Yasulich. And then basically, as I just explained in the previous conversation, Marx was deeply interested in not only ecology, but also in the non-Western pre-capitalist societies. And then he highly evaluated these Russian agricultural communes precisely because these societies were not only collectively managing production and consumption, But as a result, they are much more equal, but they are much more sustainable. And then that condition for equality and sustainability actually comes from this stability of production following the tradition for many, many years. Marx used to think, with the example of India, these traditional societies must be destroyed because they're just boring. But now he thinks that all this is actually important because capitalism is dynamic, but it's just simply destroying so many things. He thinks that although stability is actually also a condition for sustainability. And then he thinks that the Western society have to return to those non-Western societies. And I think that's a very interesting moment. He doesn't use the term degrowth, of course, but he's closest to this idea of degrowth. And then that's why I decided to call it his last vision of communism, degrowth communism.
You reactivate Marx on sustainability, you reactivate Marx on ecology. Right now you're working on a new project in which you're reactivating Marx against war. Now we are seeing war ravaging countries like Ukraine, like Gaza. So how can Marx help us to rethink our current situation?
Yeah, so this book I wrote in Japanese 2020. So under the influence of these global ecological movements like Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion. So at the time, we still had, a lot of hope. Maybe we somehow could manage decarbonization, like a rapid decarbonization by 2030. But what happened in the last, especially 2-3 years, is started with war in Ukraine, but there's inflation, and then the genocide in Gaza, and then now Trump is re-elected, and then I now live in Germany, and then AfD, this Alternative for Deutschland, the extreme right-wing party, get 25% of the vote, right? So it's like one every 4 person actually supports in Germany that kind of fascist ideas. And so the world is divided, and Trump doesn't care about climate change, so we will lose another 4 years, meaning that it's almost 2030. And then last year, we basically, our world temperature is higher than more higher than 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial time, meaning overshooting the Paris Agreement target. So the situation is very dark. I think we are now entering to the situation. It's too late to save the planet. We will have more inflation, more natural disasters, more conflicts, more inequality. So in this book, I discussed 4 futures. And then one that is closest that we are now entering is climate fascism. The society characterized by extreme inequality with anti-liberal, racist control of society and so on. So this is a kind of dark time that we will witness more in the future. In this situation, so I came to recognize degrowth communism alone is not enough. I still think this is kind of like bottom-up radical movement of creating commons is really important because we will have more disasters, and then we have to help each other more. We have to focus more on caring and repairing nature and so on. So degrowth communism is really about that kind of solidarity and care and so on. But at the same time, I think now degrowth needs to learn from socialist tradition of economic planning. I think degrowth is often too small scale, and then they can't really fight against planetary ecological crisis. And then this global capitalism is really big. I think now, so I learned, as a socialist, I learned a lot from degrowth side in the last 5 years. Now I think it's time that the degrowth side also learns from socialist side. Then that's how socialism has a very rich debate of economic calculation, planning, especially in the 20s in Soviet, of course, but also in Austria. There's these people like Otto Neurath and so on. There's a lot of debates on calculation, and I'm interested in like, reviving that kind of tradition in order to imagine a way of guaranteeing the satisfaction of everyone's basic needs, as well as security and creating the rapid transformation to a more sustainable society in the middle of disaster. So this is something what I call war economy. And so that's something that I'm working on right now, and then I hope that I can share more of these ideas soon.
I can't wait to read you. Saitō-san, arigato gozaimasu.
Yes, so much.
Thank you so much.
Lucy.